What is up, guys? In this 40k video, it's not going to be as structured, but I do have some bullet point thoughts about the Votann, Space Marines, and how I think they are fairly similar, and also, obviously, they are fairly different. But without further ado, let's get into the video. I hope you guys enjoy. Now, getting straight into it, like before, as I said before, this isn't as thought out, methodical, structured out as previous videos, but we're going to get straight into some similarities, some differences to the Votann Space Marines, and obviously why I think that the Votann as an army are the closest analog to Space Marines of any color, whether it's Chaos Space Marines, Thousand Sons, Emperor's Children, or any Loyalist chapter, than any other army to compare them to. First off, we're going to get straight into the army rule. That's a very big key difference. Now, I'm going to have two images up of them on the screen right now. But prioritized efficiency and oath of moment, two very different army rules that want you to play in two different ways. Now, granted, in the case of Space Marines, oath of moment can be used in a more open and on-demand way. Of course, depending on what Space Marine chapter you're playing, you may not have access to Oath of Moment, like if you're playing Black Templars, or you may not be getting a +1 to wound against the Oath of Moment target if you're playing Blood Angels or Dark Angels, as an example. So that's something to point out. And in the case of prioritized efficiency for the Votann, it's prioritizing you to play the primary objective. Now that's also that's a good thing, but also sort of a bad thing, because depending on your opponent, depending on who goes first, deployment, as the Votann player, you may be put into a rough situation to where you cannot quickly acquire assets, hold them, fortify, and then get into fortified takeover later on to then have just overall more survivability once your units are on objectives. So there's that. So big difference number one there. But getting into where I get this idea of Space Marines of whatever color being a good analog or being a good comparable faction to the Votann, or the Votann being a good comparable faction to them, is besides their army rule being different, besides the Votann on average being slower and not as healthy, or not as able to take a hit, but they are tough. The Votann do have very comparable data sheets to Space Marines. Whether we're talking about war gear options like the Autok Pattern Bolter, Volkite Disintegrator, Edekarn Plasma Gun, or the Ion Beamer, a lot of the Votann's weapons do have analogs to Space Marine weapons they're either a little bit better or roughly the same, or roughly equivalent. Now, just as an immediate example, we can look at Steeljacks, right? We'll just use these guys as as a basis. If you look at their bolters, the first thing you're going to notice is, compared to a bolt rifle of the Space Marine Intercessors, it has no AP, it doesn't have Assault and Heavy, and it has a worse ballistic score, but besides that, it's the same number of attacks, same range, same strength, same damage. That's overall not bad. That's basically the same thing as Chaos Space Marine bolt guns. Chaos Space Marine bolt guns, off of my knowledge, off of my recollection, same number of attacks, same range, hitting on 3s instead of hitting on 4s, same strength, same AP, same damage. Obviously, they don't have the pistol keyword because Steeljacks use their bolters like pistols. So there's that. The other comparison and similarity is, look at the Plasma Sword. Plasma Swords, their closest analog from anything in the Space Marine range or Chaos Space Marine range is Power Swords, with the biggest difference being that a Power Sword is strength 5 compared to the Plasma Swords strength 6. Also, the Plasma Swords for the Steeljack with melee weapons have 6 attacks compared to Power Swords, I think, having 3 or 4 attacks. So, and of course, these have sustained hits. So that's also another big difference. But the general bones of what I'm getting at here is the same. If you're used to Space Marines with certain profiles, you're going to find some similarities and some differences between them. You compare uh you compare the Hearthguard and their concussion gauntlets. Their concussion gauntlets are just power fists. 2 attacks hitting on threes, strength 8, AP 2, damage 2. Compare that, you look at that and like, okay, it's not bad. What about the Intercessor Sergeant with a power fist? Power fists are 3 attacks hitting on threes, strength 8, AP 2, damage 2. The biggest difference there is the number of attacks. So just as an immediate thing, similarities are that if you're used to Space Marines, if you're used to the general profiles of them, playing the Votann, you're going to notice that things are going to be, generally speaking, very similar, with marked differences being your infantry is a little bit more fragile once they actually take damage. And the other big difference is that the Votann, as an army, are more of a mid-range army, i.e., they're mostly going to have 24-inch range weapons, with maybe some things reaching out to 30 or 36 inches, and then some things being 18 inches or 12 inches. Jaegers are a perfect example of a unit that have 12 to 18-inch weapons, depending on what warrior options you have. And then another unit that is a good indicator of weapons that can reach further past 24 inches would be like the Hecaton Land Fortress, Sagittar, which I don't have one in my Votann army, or certain options that Hearthkin warriors can have, if I'm not mistaken. So there is that immediately. Another big difference to point out is, and this is the big elephant in the room, right? Is Space Marines have a far larger model range, therefore they can have far more specialized units doing very particular roles compared to the Votann, where the Votann have a more limited range, and that's mostly in part because they are a newer army. But the Votann have this situation where a lot of their units have war gear options and can then be equipped to deal with, or would be specialized at that point to do what you want them to do. So if you want Thunderkin to be your Eradicator equivalents from Space Marines, you can equip them with the Graviton Blast Cannon, and they be your anti-vehicle, anti-monster units. You want them to be your anti-elite, just kind of shoot into whatever and it doesn't matter unit, then you can equip them with SP conversion beamers. Or do you want them to be your heavy bolter shooting guys? You give them bolt cannons. You can specialize them however you want. It really doesn't matter technically. All that compared to Space Marines, where if you want to do that, all that kind of stuff, you have to take specific units. You have to take Eradicators for your anti-tank. You have to take Heavy Intercessors for your large volume of heavy bolter fire. You have to all that. That's a pro and con for Votann and a pro and con for Space Marines. It's just Space Marines have too many specialized units, and Votann have very general units that can be kitted out to specialize into something, which I think is ultimately that is a better problem to have for the Votann than it is for the Space Marines. Another marked difference between the Votann and Space Marines is that the Votann, on average, are slow. Now, if you're someone who's used to playing like Death Guard or Necrons, a 5-inch movement army isn't really a problem. As someone who plays primarily Space Marines that have 6 to 8 inches of movement, I don't think Votann having 5 inches of movement is really that big of an issue. Yeah, it means that they're slow, and there are some times where I've personally felt like that having that 1 inch less movement does suck. It's not that much of a big deal, at least not for me. Granted, I play Votann a lot more leaning into shooting than melee. I do have Steeljacks and Hearthguard capable of melee or doing melee, but everything else is there to just shoot and throw and just shoot gun. Compared to Black Templars over here, where it's like melee with some shooting, a lot of shooting, but like some shooting. Another marked difference, and something to point out with the Votann, is that on average they're also a small army, or not small as in like. Let me rephrase that, because that's gonna sound confusing. What I mean by small, I mean by the model sizes, and unit sizes are going to be kind of small. Like the footprint that they take up on the board is going to be small. So an immediate example of comparison is you take intercessors. So let's just copy. So for the sake of this, I'm gonna copy and put off to the side a unit of 10 Hearthkin warriors, and we're gonna take a unit of 10 assault intercessors, just to use as an analog for any unit of 10 Space Marines, a normal size 32 millimeter Space Marines. But the immediate thing you're going to notice is that, okay, the Votann in a 10-man unit of Hearthkin warriors take up a fair bit less space. Now, it's not too much less space, but still, it's less space. You can fit these guys, scrunch them up all together a bit more tightly than your standard Astartes battle brother. On top of the fact being that because the Votann, or like in this case, the Hearthkin warriors are actually a fair bit tougher and have a fair bit more meaner shooting than your intercessor unit of 10 or your stern, well, maybe not your stern guard veteran, but like, you know, your intercessor unit of 10. These guys can kind of be little buggers, you know. They can really just mess you up, and this is especially true when we take a unit like uh like Hearthguard, right? Let's just take a unit of 10 Hearthguard, and we'll set them aside, and then because I had this ready off to the side to just take, you take a unit of Scarab Occult Terminators. We'll use these as a stand-in for standard Terminators. If you wanted to deep strike a unit of Hearthguard compared to a unit of Terminators, the Hearthguard can get into more tight spaces because they're on 32 millimeter bases. These guys are on smaller bases, they take up less space, they can fit in places. That's even including if you had a character like a Call or an Ironhair Champion. This unit, this full-size unit, is cheaper than the Terminators, smaller, and if we're comparing them to like Loyalist Terminators, better shooting and on par melee with a better ability. Overall, really solid. But it's also one of those. It's also in this case, in this comparison example, if you were to compare standard Space Marine Terminators to Hearthguard, Hearthguard aren't as tanky. They're 2-up save with a 5-up invuln and 2 wounds compared to Terminators, which are 2-up save, 4-up invuln with 3 wounds. You know, they're not as able to sit on the board and take it, but they can definitely take it. Now, another point of comparison and another thing to point out is if you've played Space Marines and you're used to running an army that has a repulsor executioner or a land raider of some kind, a large transport vehicle that can transport a brick of guys and has some fairly respectable shooting, the Votann are going to be fairly similar to this in the fact that they do make use of a lot of transports. You have your Hecaton Land Fortress, you have your Sagittar, you have your Capricus carriers. Now, on the flip side, the Votann don't have too many options of dedicated vehicles that just do shooting. The only option they really have is the Capricus Defender, which I do not have in this army, but it's basically just a Capricus with actual war gear options to choose from. But getting back to the original point, if you're used to playing Space Marines and you're used to having 1 or 2 land raiders, then playing Votann and using an army that has 1 or 2 land fortresses, you're going to notice that, oh, this is actually fairly similar. And in terms of looking at the data sheets, like I've pointed out in my previous video talking about the land fortress and land raider, both of these vehicles are fairly similar. If you're used to running a land raider or even a repulsor executioner or a standard repulsor, playing the Votann and using a Hecaton Land Fortress or 2 is not going to feel that different. However, there is one difference that you're going to immediately notice and you're going to pick up on and be like, wow, this feels a lot better. And that is the Land Fortress is a bit smaller, making it easier to navigate around terrain, you know, moving up the board. Because a Land Fortress is thinner by a fair bit than a Land Raider or a Repulsor, it's easier to navigate in between tighter spaces. You can also fit a land fortress into a location that maybe a land raider wouldn't be able to fit into, but it would like to fit into. Just on a base, like on the comparison, a land fortress is roughly as wide, if not a tiny bit wider, than a predator. That's not unsubstantial. That's actually that's really solid. And just from the comparison of the size profile, it's also roughly not that much longer than a predator. Oh, compare that to the land raider. A land raider is a little bit longer than the land fortress, and if we overlay it like this, which is kind of hard to see, but you can tell the land raider takes up more space. So that's another immediate thing that you're going to notice when you go from playing Space Marines and you try out Votann. The other big thing, too, another big key takeaway, and this is, I think, more a symptom of just new army versus army that's been around for like ever since the beginning of the edition, is because the model range is so limited with the Votann, you don't have a lot of character support of certain units that you may want, so it may end up wanting to run. So if you so happen to want to play a army that utilizes a lot of Chthonian Berserks, which are the melee, shirtless Votann with the plasma axes, you can't attach a character to them because they don't have a character that works with them. That kind of sucks. Steeljacks are with melee weapons. They're a pretty good melee unit, but the problem is they only really have two characters that can attach them. And that's the Memnir Strategist and the Brocure Ironmaster. But the problem is both those characters are kind of whatever for them. I mean, granted, the Memnir Strategist can allow the unit to Overwatch or Heroic Intervention for free, but like if you want to use them for like a melee kind of just death ball kind of unit, you don't have options there. Yes, Hearthguard can be made that way with a Call or an Einherjar champion, but besides Hearthguard having decent or good character support, besides Hearthkin Warriors having good and decent character support, and even like that's really it. That's really all she wrote when it comes to character support. So you're gonna notice that too, if you're jumping from Space Marines to Votann, is that Votann have a lot less character support for specific things. You're also going to notice that in terms of vehicle support, a lot of Votann vehicles are transports. They only have one dedicated non-transport vehicle, and that is the Capricus Defender. So in conclusion, before we wrap up here, if you're used to playing Space Marines, if you enjoy playing Space Marines and you want to experiment with something that doesn't feel terribly, terribly different, but has enough differences to be like, oh, wow, this is actually like a little refreshing, or this makes me think or strategize in a slightly different way. I do think the Votann are definitely that. I do think the Votann as an army give you a slightly fresher perspective on some things. You're because you're going to be playing an army that's tougher, slower, harder hitting and shooting, and even in to a degree melee. But when those things come through, when those bolt rounds come through and get through vitals, you're going to take casualties. You're going to end up losing guys. So it does make you kind of have to think a bit more strategically, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think that's ultimately a good thing. As a personal account from myself, part of why I got into Votann and became interested in them was not because they were just space dwarves and they looked kind of they look cool, but it was because when I read their data sheets, when I read their index rules, and then later on I reread their codex and everything, I looked at them and I just went, wow, like these guys are like Space Marines, and I like Space Marines, but the problem I have with Space Marines is I just don't think their shooting is very satisfying. I think the biggest thing that makes Space Marines so not satisfying, for me at least, is their guns just feel like inadequate. Melee's not the problem. Like melee feels great. It's just the shooting, unless we're talking about like shooting repulsor executioners or shooting Redemptor dreadnoughts or land raiders or or predators, whether we're talking about from like Space Marines or Chaos Space Marines. Like vehicle shooting always felt fine. It's just my basic troops, my battle line, my infantry, all of that always felt middling. All of that felt always bad. Even when I prioritized the right targets that these units should be shooting into, if they are a shooting unit, it just never felt good. Whereas with the Votann, a lot of it from what I read and then also experienced in my trying them in the index days, trying them post codex, and then experimenting by myself, I look at the Votann and I'm like, wow, like although their ballistics are a little bit worse, although their volume of attacks may be a little worse, the fact that they tend to wound, they actually tend to get through, and they do damage, in my opinion, was a breath of fresh air. And it's like, wow, like this is an army that I feel like Space Marines kind of should be, where their guns just hit hard, their guns are actually fairly reliable, and then their melee is still not really a joke. Like even if you jump these guys into melee, there is a likelihood that they could punch your teeth out. Maybe not necessarily kill. Maybe not necessarily be like the most effective in melee, but they can still be capable little brick shit houses and beat the crap out of someone. But until the day that they add an Ironkin Dreadnought kind of equivalent, oh man, dude, if GW do that, if GW aren't too cowardly to give the Votann their Dreadnoughts equivalent, ooh baby, might be seeing me play more Dwarf. but um, but with that, guys, that'll be the end of the video. I hope you guys found the video insightful, entertaining, informative. If you think my opinions and perspective on the Votann compared to Space Marines is wrong or uneducated, feel free to let me know in the comments. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. I'm not an authority on Space Marines or the Votann. I can clearly always get something wrong. Rules can change in the future. So don't take what I say as gospel. I'm just a guy who likes Space Marines, likes Votann, and noticed differences and similarities, and things felt good. These are just general points to bring up. But feel free to like the video if you liked it. Feel free to dislike it if you disliked it. Let me know in the future if you'd like to see more content like this down below. This is different than my other thoughts videos. This is not like this wasn't a slideshow. This was a bit more off the cuff. It is really early in the morning / late at night for me, so it's been on my mind. But with that, I hope you guys have been having a great time wherever you may find yourself, and wherever you've been, whether you're at home, you're at work, you're at school, or you're on vacation or whatever have you. Hope you're having a great time. If you're not having a good time or things are going badly, I hope things can turn around, and no doubt they will turn around. But until the next time, guys, I'll see you next time. Peace.